The glob of spit hit my cheek with a wet, contemptuous smack. It clung there for a moment, a vile mixture of his saliva and my tears, before tracing a slow, humiliating path down my face. The world seemed to freeze. The cheerful chatter of my parents' anniversary party, the clinking of glasses, the soft music playing in the background, it all dissolved into a deafening roar in my ears. All I could see was his face, twisted into a mask of pure, undiluted hatred. All I could feel was the stunned, horrified silence of my own mother and father, standing just feet away, watching this nightmare unfold. 9, he hissed, the word a venomous whisper that cut deeper than any shout. 9 times you failed me. 9 girls. What am I supposed to do with a house full of useless girls? NHE didn't just say the words. He spat them, each one a poison dart aimed at my heart. He had waited for this moment. He had chosen the one place I should have felt safest, surrounded by the people who loved me most, to utterly and completely destroy me. He wanted witnesses to my humiliation. He wanted to burn my world down and dance on the ashes. My pride, the carefully constructed dam that had held back years of quiet disappointment and simmering resentment, didn't just crack. It shattered. The shame was a physical force, a crushing weight that buckled my knees and stole the air from my lungs. I was his wife, the mother of his 9 children, and he had just reduced me to nothing more than a target for his disgust, right in front of my own parents. In that moment, as his spit dripped from my chin onto the pristine white tablecloth, I knew my marriage wasn't just over. I knew a war had just begun. NIF, your blood is already boiling. You know what to do. Hit that like button and subscribe, because you have to hear how this story of betrayal finds its ultimate justice. Let's get into it. Our life from the outside was a masterpiece of suburban perfection. David wasn't just a husband. He was an institution in our town. He was the 3rd-generation owner of Sterling Homes, the most prestigious construction company in the state. He didn't just build houses. He built legacies, sprawling mansions for the wealthy and influential. His name was synonymous with quality, power, and tradition. When I married him, I wasn't just marrying a man. I was marrying a dynasty. And I met him in college. I was an art history major, full of dreams of curating museums and discovering lost masterpieces. He was studying business, already mapping out the expansion of his family's empire. He was charming, confident, and overwhelmingly persuasive. He pursued me with a single-minded focus that I mistook for passion. He saw me, he said, as the perfect partner, someone with the grace and elegance to stand by his side. He promised me a life where I would never have to worry about anything, a life of beauty and security. It was a seductive promise, and I, a girl from a modest, middle-class family, fell for it completely. And our wedding was the social event of the year. It was a grand, opulent affair held at the country club, a testament to the Sterling name. I felt like a princess in a fairy tale. We moved into a magnificent house that David had designed and built himself, a sprawling stone manor with manicured gardens and a breathtaking view of the valley. It was my gilded cage, though I didn't see the bars for years. NTHE, first hint of the rot beneath the polished surface, came with the birth of our first daughter, Isabella. I was ecstatic. She was a perfect, beautiful baby with David's dark hair and my blue eyes. David smiled for the photos, accepted the congratulations, and played the part of the proud father. But in the quiet moments, when it was just the 3 of us, a subtle coolness settled in. "A girl is nice to start with," he said one evening, looking down at Isabella in her crib. "But the firstborn son is the one who carries the torch. The Sterling legacy needs a Sterling heir." I brushed it off as an old-fashioned sentiment, a relic of his traditional upbringing. His father, a formidable patriarch even in retirement, had drilled into him the importance of a male heir to take over the family business. It was a pressure I couldn't fully understand, but I was sure our love was stronger than any outdated tradition. NTWO years later, our twin daughters, Sophia and Olivia, were born. They were a double blessing, and my heart overflowed with love. David's reaction was more muted. He hired a second nanny and threw himself deeper into his work. The narrative began to solidify. 3 girls, he'd say to his friends at the club, forcing a laugh. I'm outnumbered. We'll have to keep trying for that boy. The joke was always followed by a tight, humorless smile. The pressure was no longer subtle. It was a constant, low hum in the background of our lives. With each subsequent pregnancy, the expectation grew heavier. Amelia came next, then Mia, then Charlotte. With each birth announcement that proclaimed, "It's a girl," a small piece of the warmth in our marriage chipped away. David was never overtly cruel to them. He provided for them lavishly, ensuring they had the best clothes, the best schools, the best of everything money could buy. But his love was conditional, his attention fleeting. He was a spectator in their lives, an audience member watching a play he had no interest in. He would attend their recitals and school events, but his eyes would be on his phone, his mind clearly elsewhere. He was waiting for the main act, the son who would make his life and his legacy complete. NTHE gilded cage began to feel smaller, the air thinner. My art history degree gathered dust on a shelf. My days were consumed with managing the household, the staff, and the schedules of our growing family. I was the perfect corporate wife, hosting flawless dinner parties and charity events, always smiling, always poised. But inside, I was shrinking. My dreams had been replaced by his obsession. Our conversations revolved around one topic: the next pregnancy, the next chance for a boy. He started researching gender selection methods, bringing home articles and brochures, turning the sacred act of creating a life into a cold, calculated business transaction. I was no longer his partner. I was a vessel, a beautiful but flawed machine that kept producing the wrong product. The love that had once felt like a grand romance now felt like a performance, and I was forgetting my lines. An NTHE birth of our 7th and 8th daughters, Evelyn and Grace, marked a significant turning point. They were born prematurely and spent weeks in the NICU. It was a terrifying, emotionally draining experience. I barely left the hospital, sitting by their incubators, praying for their survival. David's visits were brief and perfunctory. He would stand at the door, looking uncomfortable and out of place, before making an excuse about a meeting he couldn't miss. NHI's disappointment was now a palpable entity in our home. It was a cold, silent guest that sat with us at the dinner table. He stopped talking about next time. A grim resignation had set in, replaced by a quiet, simmering resentment that was far more frightening than his previous, more vocal pressure. He started spending more time at the office, taking business trips that seemed to stretch longer and longer. When he was home, he moved through the house like a ghost, his presence a constant, unspoken accusation. I tried to bridge the chasm between us. "David, look at our beautiful girls," I'd say, my voice pleading. "They are smart and funny and kind. Isn't this enough? Aren't we enough?" NHE would just look at me with dead eyes. "You don't understand what's at stake, Catherine," he'd reply, his voice flat. "My father built this company from the ground up, his father before him. The Sterling name means something. It needs to continue. A son-in-law is not the same. It's not in the blood, and it was a poison that had been passed down through generations, an archaic belief that a woman's worth was tied to her ability to produce a male heir. His identity was so intertwined with this notion of legacy that he couldn't see the 9 incredible legacies I had already given him. Our daughters were not people to him. They were reminders of his perceived failure, of my failure. When I discovered I was pregnant for the 9th time, I didn't feel joy. I felt a cold, paralyzing dread. I hid it from him for as long as I could, the growing secret a heavy weight in my belly. I knew this was the last chance. My body was tired, and my spirit was worn thin. The thought of seeing that flicker of desperate hope in his eyes, only to have it extinguished again, was more than I could bear. NTHE Day, I finally told him. His reaction was unnervingly calm. He didn't smile. He didn't touch my stomach. He just nodded slowly and said, "9th time's the charm, I suppose." It wasn't a statement of hope, it was an ultimatum. An unspoken contract had been drawn. If this baby was a boy, our marriage might survive. If it was another girl, the consequences would be severe. NTHE pregnancy was my most difficult yet. I was older, exhausted, and emotionally fragile. David treated me with a detached, clinical precision. He monitored my diet, my exercise, my sleep. He insisted on a new, expensive doctor who specialized in high-risk pregnancies, not out of concern for my health, but because he believed this doctor could somehow influence the outcome. At the 20-week ultrasound, the technician was a kind woman who had been with me for my last few pregnancies. She moved the wand over my belly, her brow furrowed in concentration. She typed a few notes, then looked at me, her eyes soft with a pity I'd come to know all too well. She didn't have to say a word. I already knew. "It's a healthy baby girl," she whispered, as if breaking the news of a terminal illness. I closed my eyes and a single tear escaped, tracing a path down my temple. It wasn't a tear of disappointment in my child. It was a tear of fear of the man I would have to go home to. I made the technician promise not to put the gender in the official report. I needed to buy myself a few more months of peace. I would let David live in his bubble of desperate hope, because I knew the moment it burst, my world would come crashing down. It was a cowardly act, a stay of execution, but it was the only way I knew how to survive. NMY parents' 40th wedding anniversary was supposed to be a beacon of light in my increasingly dark world. They were the embodiment of a true partnership, their love a quiet, steady flame that had weathered every storm. Their home was my sanctuary, the one place I could shed the heavy armor of being Mrs. David Sterling and just be Catherine. The party was an intimate gathering in their beautiful backyard. Family, close friends, a celebration of enduring love, NFOR weeks leading up to it. David was unusually attentive. He helped me pick out a gift, complimented my dress, and even smiled at the girls. I allowed myself a sliver of hope. Maybe he was finally coming to terms with our life. Maybe he was learning to see the value in our family, regardless of gender. I was a fool. It wasn't acceptance I was seeing. It was calculation. He was setting the stage. NTHE day of the party was perfect. The sun was shining, the garden was in full bloom, and the air was filled with laughter. Our daughters, dressed in matching summer dresses, played on the lawn, a beautiful whirlwind of youthful energy. For a few hours, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. I watched my parents, still holding hands after 4 decades, and dared to dream that maybe, just maybe, David and I could find our way back to that. NTHE ambush came just after the cake was cut. My father had just given a touching toast to my mother, his voice thick with emotion. Everyone was happy, their hearts full. David chose that precise moment to strike. NHE walked over to me, his smile gone, replaced by a chillingly calm expression. "Catherine," he said, his voice just loud enough for those closest to us, my parents, my sister, my uncle, to hear. "I have an announcement to make," and a confused silence fell over our small group. He took my hand, his grip like ice. "As you all know, Catherine and I are expecting our 9th child. We just got the final confirmation from the doctor this morning." He paused, letting the anticipation build. He looked directly at me, his eyes boring into mine. "It's another girl." NHE said the words with a flat, final finality. The air crackled with tension. My mother's smile faltered. My father's hand tightened on her arm. I felt the blood drain from my face. This was it. The contract was being called due. "N9, he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. He let go of my hand and took a small step back, as if to put distance between himself and something unclean. 9 daughters. 9 failures to produce a single, solitary heir to carry my family's name. NMY father stepped forward. "David, that's enough. This is not the time or the place." David ignored him. His focus was entirely on me. His face, which I had once loved, was contorting into a grotesque mask of rage and disgust. "I have given you everything, Catherine. A beautiful home, a life of luxury. All I asked for in return was one thing. One son. And you couldn't even do that. David, please, I whispered, my voice trembling. My carefully constructed composure was crumbling. I could feel the eyes of my family on me, their shock and pity a physical blow. Please what? He sneered. Please pretend that this is okay? That my legacy can be handed over to some stranger who marries one of them? That my father's life's work will be managed by someone not of my blood? NHE took another step closer, his body radiating a terrifying energy. He was leaning into my space, his voice dropping to that venomous hiss. You have been a complete and utter disappointment to me, as a wife, as a woman. And then he did it. He drew his head back slightly, gathered the saliva in his mouth, and spat directly in my face. The sound was like a gunshot in the sudden, deathly silence. The shock was so profound, so absolute, that for a second no one moved. It was an act of such primal disrespect, of such utter contempt, that it defied comprehension. My pride, my dignity, my sense of self, it all collapsed in that single vile moment. The shame was a hot, suffocating wave. He hadn't just insulted me. He had branded me as worthless in front of the two people whose opinion mattered most in the world. He had taken my deepest insecurity and hung it around my neck like a millstone. As I stood there, frozen in horror, with his spit cooling on my cheek, I saw the triumphant, cruel glint in his eyes. He had won. He had broken me. An NTHE spell of horrified silence was broken by my father. A roar of pure, primal rage erupted from his chest, a sound I had never heard from my gentle, quiet dad. He lunged at David, his face a mask of fury. You son of a bitch, he bellowed, shoving David backward with a force that sent him stumbling into a table of champagne glasses, which crashed to the ground in a shower of crystal and foam. NMY uncle and brother-in-law immediately jumped in, pulling my father back as David regained his footing, his face livid. The party had devolved into chaos. Guests were staring, frozen in disbelief. My mother rushed to my side, her hands fluttering, tears streaming down her face as she tried to wipe my cheek with a napkin, but I barely registered her touch. Something inside me had snapped. The shame that had buckled my knees moments before was now crystallizing into something else. It was a cold, hard, diamond-sharp fury. The Catherine who cried, the Catherine who pleaded, the Catherine who tried to please him, she had died in that moment. In her place stood a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose, and I held up a hand, stopping my mother. My voice, when I spoke, was unnervingly calm. It cut through the chaos like a shard of ice. Get out, I said. My eyes locked on David's and he scoffed, straightening his designer jacket. This is a family party, Catherine. I'm not going anywhere. This is my family, I retorted, my voice gaining strength. And you are no longer a part of it. Get out of my parents' house. Now, NMY father, still struggling against my uncle's hold, shouted, You heard her. Get the hell off my property before I kill you. David looked around at the faces staring at him, my sister's disgust, my uncle's fury, the shocked expressions of our friends. He seemed to realize he had miscalculated. He had expected me to crumble, to weep, to run and hide. He had not expected this cold, defiant rage. He had not expected my family to close ranks around me so fiercely. NHE gave a short, humorless laugh, a sound of pure arrogance. Fine, he spat, adjusting his cuffs. Enjoy your little pity party. You'll be hearing from my lawyer. You and your 9 little disappointments will be out of my house by the end of the week. NHE turned and strode away without a backward glance, leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. The moment he was gone, the strength that had surged through me evaporated, and my legs finally gave out. I sank onto a garden bench, my body shaking uncontrollably as the full weight of what had just happened crashed down on me. My mother and sister wrapped their arms around me, and I finally let out a single, ragged sob. It wasn't a sob of sadness. It was a sob of war, NTHAT night. I didn't go back to the stone mansion. I stayed in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the ghosts of the girl I used to be. My father, his face grim and set, made a phone call. He was calling Eleanor Vance, one of the most feared divorce attorneys in the state. She was known as the Shark, a woman who didn't just win cases, she annihilated her opponents. I don't care what it costs. I heard my father say into the phone, his voice low and dangerous. I want him to pay for what he did to my daughter. I want you to take everything. While he was on the phone, I sat at my old desk and wrote. I made a list. It wasn't a list of assets or possessions. It was a list of every quiet insult, every dismissive gesture, every moment of conditional love, every time he had made me feel like I was less than nothing. I listed the 9 pregnancies, the 9 heartbreaks, the 9 times he had looked at his own child with disappointment. The list grew longer and longer, each word a piece of kindling for the fire that was now burning inside me. David thought he had won by humiliating me. He thought he had broken me. But he had made a fatal error. He had pushed me so far down that I had finally hit bedrock. And from that solid, unshakable foundation of rock bottom, I was going to build an empire of my own, an empire of justice, and I would use its power to grind his world to dust. He had declared war on the wrong woman. Meeting Eleanor Vance was like meeting a force of nature. She was a woman in her late 50s, impeccably dressed in a steel gray suit, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Her office was a sleek, modern space high above the city, a war room where fortunes and futures were decided. My parents came with me, a silent, supportive presence. I sat across from her polished mahogany desk and told her everything. I didn't cry. I laid out the facts with the same cold precision I had used to write my list. I spoke of the obsession with a male heir, the emotional neglect of our daughters, the calculated cruelty of the anniversary party. When I finished, I pushed the list I had written across the desk. Eleanor read it slowly, her expression unreadable. She then looked up, not at me, but at my father. Mr. Sterling is a pillar of this community, she said, her voice neutral. His family has deep roots and deeper pockets. His legal team will be formidable. They will try to paint Catherine as unstable, greedy, a bitter woman seeking revenge. Are you prepared for that? We are prepared for anything, my father said, his voice like flint. We want him to understand the consequences of his actions. Eleanor's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. It was a chilling sight. Good, she said, turning her sharp gaze back to me, because we are not going to fight him on his terms. We are not going to fight over money or assets. That's what he expects. We are going to fight for something he values far more, his name. We are going to dismantle the Sterling legacy piece by piece. NHER plan was audacious and brilliant. It wasn't about divorce. It was about destruction. The first step was to secure my immediate safety and that of the girls. Eleanor filed an emergency protective order, citing David's public aggression and the emotional trauma inflicted upon me and our children. A judge granted it immediately, forcing David out of our home. The locks were changed that same day. The stone mansion was no longer his castle. It was my fortress. NTHE, next phase of the war, was fought in the court of public opinion. David's lawyers immediately began leaking stories to the press, painting him as the victim, a long-suffering husband pushed to his breaking point by a demanding, emotionally volatile wife. They tried to frame the spitting incident as a momentary lapse in judgment under extreme duress. Eleanor's counterattack was masterful. She didn't engage in a messy, he-said-she-said battle. Instead, she arranged for a single, exclusive interview for me with a respected national journalist, a woman known for her in-depth, compassionate storytelling. I was terrified, but Eleanor coached me for days. No anger, she instructed. No revenge, just truth. Speak as a mother. Speak for your daughters. In the interview, I didn't speak of my own pain. I spoke of my 9 beautiful, intelligent, wonderful daughters. I talked about Isabella's artistic talent, Sophia's wit, Olivia's kindness. I described how they were being raised in a home where they were taught that their father's love was something to be earned, a prize they could never win because of their gender. I didn't have to mention the spitting. The journalist did it for me, framing it as the brutal culmination of a decade of gender-based disappointment. NTHE's story exploded. The narrative David's team had tried to build was shattered. He was no longer the long-suffering husband. He was a misogynistic monster who had emotionally abused his children and humiliated his pregnant wife. The public outcry was swift and brutal. Women's groups picketed outside the Sterling Homes headquarters. Clients began pulling their multi-million-dollar contracts. The Sterling name, once a symbol of quality, was now a symbol of toxic masculinity. While the public firestorm raged, Eleanor was working in the shadows, forging the legal weapon that would deliver the final blow. She hired a team of forensic accountants to comb through every corner of the Sterling Homes empire. They dug into decades of financial records, partnership agreements, and tax filings. David thought our fight was about the divorce. He had no idea that Eleanor was building a case that would threaten the very foundation of his identity and his family's legacy. I was no longer just a scorned wife. I was the general of an army, and we were preparing for a siege that would leave his kingdom in ruins. The divorce proceedings were a mere sideshow to the main event Eleanor was orchestrating. In court, David's lawyers fought tooth and nail over every asset, every dollar. They tried to portray me as a gold digger, but Eleanor skillfully dismantled their arguments, presenting a clear picture of David's emotional cruelty and his calculated campaign of humiliation. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman, was clearly not impressed with David or his tactics. NBUT, the real battle was happening outside the family court. The forensic accountants Eleanor had hired found what they were looking for. It was buried deep in the company's archives, a pattern of financial misconduct stretching back decades, started by David's grandfather and continued by his father and then by him. It involved shell corporations, fraudulent invoicing, and illegal kickbacks to city officials to secure building permits and favorable zoning changes. The Sterling Homes empire, that great bastion of tradition and quality, was built on a foundation of corruption. Eleanor presented the findings to the district attorney's office. The evidence was undeniable and explosive. A full-scale criminal investigation was launched into Sterling Homes. Suddenly, David wasn't just fighting for his house and his investment portfolio. He was fighting for his freedom. NTHE Day, the indictments came down, was a day I will never forget. David, his father, and several key executives were arrested and charged with fraud, racketeering, and bribery. The news was the lead story on every channel. The image of David, the titan of industry, being led away in handcuffs was a far greater humiliation than anything he could have ever inflicted on me. His pride, his name, his legacy, it was all collapsing under the weight of his own family's sins, sins that would have remained buried if he hadn't pushed me to unearth them. NTHE trial was a media circus. One by one, former employees and city officials, granted immunity, testified against the Sterlings. The defense crumbled. The jury found them guilty on all major counts. David and his father were sentenced to significant prison terms. The company was hit with fines so massive it was forced into bankruptcy. The Sterling name was not just tarnished, it was utterly destroyed. In the divorce settlement, I wasn't awarded a portion of a thriving empire, I was awarded the remnants. The Stone Mansion, which was in my name and thus protected from the corporate bankruptcy, was mine free and clear. I also received a substantial settlement from David's personal assets that hadn't been tied to the company. It was more than enough to secure my daughters' futures and my own. NBUT, my victory wasn't financial. It was something far deeper. It was the knowledge that I had not only survived, but I had protected my daughters from a toxic legacy. I had fought for their right to be valued for who they are, not for their gender. A few weeks after the sentencing, I received a letter from David in prison. It was a rambling, hate-filled tirade, blaming me for everything. He called me a vindictive snake, a destroyer of families. He still didn't get it. He still couldn't see that he was the architect of his own downfall. I didn't write back. I simply threw the letter into the fireplace and watched it burn, the last remnant of a life I had thankfully left behind. The war was over. I had won. NNTHE years that followed were a study in quiet reconstruction. The first thing I did was sell the stone mansion. It was a beautiful house, but it was filled with the ghosts of unhappiness. It was a monument to David's ego, not a home. I sold it to a developer who planned to subdivide the property, erasing the last physical trace of the Sterling estate. With the proceeds, I bought a lovely, rambling old house in a different town, a place with a big, wild garden and no pretense. It had character and warmth. Together, my daughters and I filled it not with designer furniture and cold art, but with laughter, mismatched paintings, and the beautiful chaos of a large, loving family. And I went back to school and finished my art history degree, and then I got a master's in art therapy. I opened a small studio where I worked with children who had experienced trauma, helping them find a voice through creativity. My own past, once a source of shame, became my greatest asset, allowing me to connect with them on a level of deep understanding. NMY daughters thrived. Freed from the suffocating weight of their father's disapproval, they blossomed into their true selves. Isabella became a passionate painter, her canvases exploding with color. Sophia and Olivia, the inseparable twins, both developed a love for science and announced their intention to become doctors. Each of my 9 girls, from Amelia to little Luna, who was born shortly after the divorce, grew into a unique, confident, and compassionate young woman. They were not my failures. They were my 9 greatest triumphs. One sunny afternoon, I was in the garden, planting roses with Luna, now a bright-eyed 6-year-old. My older daughters were scattered around the yard, reading, playing music, living their lives with a freedom I had fought so hard to give them. Isabella, now in college, came and sat beside me. "Mom," she said, watching her youngest sister dig happily in the dirt, "I saw an article online today. Dad is up for parole soon." And I paused, my hands deep in the rich soil. I felt a flicker of something, but it wasn't fear or anger. It was a distant, detached pity for a man who had lost everything because he couldn't see the treasures he already possessed. "That's okay, sweetie," I said, smiling at her. "He has no power over us anymore." NSHE looked around at our home, at her sisters, at the life we had built together. "He wanted a legacy," she said softly, a hint of wonder in her voice. "He just didn't realize he already had one." And I looked at her, my beautiful, brilliant firstborn, and my heart swelled with a love so profound it almost hurt. "You're right," I said. I looked at my 9 daughters, my 9 legacies. They were a testament not to a name, but to a spirit of resilience, of courage, and of the unshakable power of a mother's love. David had tried to spit on my pride and drown it in shame. He didn't realize that pride, true pride, isn't something someone else can give you or take away. It's something you build yourself, from the ground up, on a foundation of truth and love. He had left me to build my house alone, not knowing I would build a fortress filled with 9 incredible reasons to be proud, a house built not of stone and steel, but of unbreakable hope.